Last time we talked about the Depression and about how FDR's New Deal collectivism became an outlet for and a manifestation of that rugged pioneer individualism so central to American self understanding of its national character. We saw that the expect less, work hard, waste not austerity ethic that FDR framed as central to national virtue during the Depression, still on the model of pioneering frontiersmanship, was flipped into a martially oriented industrial productivity. When America was called on to be the arsenal of democracy for the world, which was itself embroiled already in World War II's fight against fascism. When Americans were called on to approach manufacturing with, as FDR put it, a sense of urgency, a spirit of patriotism and sacrifice, our new politically, nationally sanctified role, our new providential design was to harness the power and the products of industrialization in defense of and in support of a set of values. We would come, to be the masters of a large-scale industrial productivity and thereby become the great defenders and supporters of democracy and of Roosevelt's four freedoms of speech, of worship, from want, and from fear. And this industrial engagement through manufacturing would do two things. In addition, of course, to defending and supporting those values consonant with the more aspirational aspects of the nation's founding, in addition to that straight mythic function, this industrialized engagement would, number one, turn the nation away from the isolationist foreign policy stance that had been strongly encouraged by Washington in his farewell address, but that also left millions of people in World War II to face genocidal violence with no meaningful defense. And this remains a tricky question for American foreign policy, especially in our contemporary context of thoroughgoing American militarization. Should we avoid foreign entanglements? Or are the fates of the nation interconnected? And with our great power, as Roosevelt told us, comes great responsibility. Should we police other national powers, or should we leave the powerless in other lands without defense? And of course, it isn't that simple. It's not an either or. There's not a wrong side and a right side of this that's any kind of clearly defined. But back to our narrative, World War II. American industrial manufacturing mobilization as the arsenal of democracy defended and supported the values of democracy and the four freedoms. And it also, number one, ended that isolationist foreign policy stance. And number two, brought America out of the Depression. Between 1939 and 1944, the United States GDP increased by 52% in constant dollars. Manufacturing output tripled. By the end of the war, the U.S. had a full half of the world's manufacturing capacity. War was good for business, and especially in its industrializing aspects, in its mass production and free market capitalism. This is one more way in which World War II really is a continuation of World War I, which, remember, was defined as much by a tragically spiraling momentum as by anything else. The industrial momentum continues here on a larger scale. Making the world safe for democracy, it turns out, is good for the bottom line. Because America was at the outset and remained throughout the war the most industrially productive nation, it was the stuff that Europe needed from the U.S. Mostly, lives would come from elsewhere. The war also required human fodder. It required lives. Under Stalin, Russian soldiers would fight for as long as they were told to. And as we've seen, Russian death tolls were staggering. America's role would go beyond that of an arsenal. On December 8th, 1941, Roosevelt delivered a speech to a joint session of Congress, a speech that was also broadcast live on the radio, which began, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." He was referring, of course, to the attack on Pearl Harbor. 33 minutes after the brief speech ended, Congress voted to declare war on Japan. 3 days later, on December 11th, 1941, Germany declares war on the U.S. The same day, December 11th, 1941, the U.S. in turn declares war on Germany and on Italy. And so America would be not only the arsenal of democracy, but also at least a small part of the armed militants waging a war on behalf of democracy. That's how it was presented. Really, it was, more than being a war for democracy, this was a war against fascism, especially genocidal fascism. On the home front, what Americans saw was total social mobilization. And as I said last time, we haven't seen that since. The Office of War Information was created in 1942, and they mostly guided and took control of what had already and very quickly become an effective propaganda campaign. Now, the war cost money, and FDR did tax. We see the left image here is a tax rate over the course of, a little more than a century. You see that high point, that's Roosevelt. Higher taxes were among the most significant actual ways that Americans made sacrifices for the war effort, and no significant voice suggested that a time of war mobilization was a good time to cut taxes. He didn't get the kind of pushback on this that you'd expect today, that you do see today. Taxes were at this time, by today's standards, exceptionally high. In 1942, the corporate tax rate was 40%, with a 95% tax rate for what were called excess profits. Between 1939 and 1944, the share of wealth held by the richest 5%, and the share of total wealth is pictured on the right, actually fell from 23.7% to 16.8%. The top marginal income tax rate, as you see, was 94%. Today it's 37%. And taxes helped to cover a great deal of the expense of this most expensive of American wars. The government spending, federal government spent $350 billion during World War II, which was twice the total amount that the federal government had spent in all its years of spending before then. 40% of that was collected through taxes. But there were also war bonds. These were also sold in World War I as defense bonds, and in World War II, Americans bought $180 billion worth of these. Buying them was a kind of consumer patriotism, the mobilization of American pocketbooks, really. They were sold at a 75% face value and matured over 10 years and were bought back at face value, so it was a very slow investment, but really a loan to the government for the war. And as you read in Smedley Butler, whom we read for World War I, they were in World War I and continued to be in World War II, manipulated by banks. But in World War II, they were sold in smaller amounts also to make it easier for poor people and even kids, as you see on the bottom right, to help support the war effort. Everyone was encouraged. They started selling what they called war stamps, which are smaller denominations. In World War I, the smallest denomination you could buy was $50, which was really out of reach for a lot of American public. But for World War II, you got down into under $1. You could buy stamps for cents. Most Americans were directly affected through increased taxes. 80 million Americans bought war bonds, and the total population at this point was under 140 million. So more than half of the American population purchased war bonds. Lots of propaganda went into this, and you see some of those examples here. Also, rationing food and gas especially. Every American got a ration book. And the propaganda support for this was also huge. And one thing to note is that rationing gas was a big deal, but we weren't actually in any kind of a fuel shortage at this point. That comes later. Gas was seen at this point as a sort of never-ending resource. Rationing gas was all about rationing rubber, saving rubber. The more gas you used, the more rubber you used. So despite the rationing during this time, consumer spending actually increased. And that's an indication that, this was inconvenience more than it was sacrifice for Americans. Granted, we were coming out of the Depression. Everyone did have a little more money, more jobs, but consumer spending during this time of great rationing actually increased. Also recycling, which we think of as a, contemporary campaign of environmental concern. Recycling campaigns help to make up for shortages in metal, in rubber, in paper, right? That people were called upon and really did mobilize to recycle everything that could be recycled. And silence was still called for, following upon and really directly engaging World War I's Anti-Espionage Act and the Anti-Sedition Act, which had been revoked. But those campaigns, anti-espionage, really came out in a great deal of propaganda. You have to be quiet. Someone talked. Someone got killed, right? Careless talk got there first, right? Also, victory gardens were a thing. People were really encouraged to use their own gardening capacity to increase their food, because food is ammunition, don't waste it, and you'll make your ration coupons go farther if you plant a victory garden. Now, the declaration by the United Nations, that the name for the United Nations is coined here with this declaration by the United Nations of January 1st, 1942, declared that the Allies were at war because they were, quote, convinced that complete victory over their enemies is essential to defend life, liberty, independence, and religious freedom. There's a way in which that was clearly true. Less than a week later, in the 1942 State of the Union, Roosevelt took up Hitler's own language and turned it back against him, saying that the world was, quote, too small to provide adequate living room for both Hitler and God. And living room or living space was something that Hitler ran on for the economically decimated German population who was feeling very crowded. Getting rid of really a lot of people in genocidal ways was going to be a way to have like a bigger backyard. But that Americans would fight as they always had, Roosevelt told us, in defense of the ideal that, quote, God created man in his own image. And so it was, with these high-minded ideals at the front of their minds and visually presented all around them, that Americans as a nation mobilized. Great Depression tendencies towards thrift and away from expectations persisted during the war era, so Americans largely found it possible to curb personal satisfactions. Suffering was limited, that was something that FDR really succeeded in as a president. He limited the suffering of Americans. The imminent fulfillment of our exceptionalism's promise was highlighted over and over. But satisfactions were curbed, and awareness was very high, which stands in stark contrast to today, whereas you've seen 42% of Americans do not know that we are still at war in Afghanistan. Americans may not have known state secrets, despite what the propaganda seemed to suggest, right? Be quiet suggested that people had this knowledge. They may not have known state secrets. Very few knew about the Manhattan Project, for instance, which would lead to the atomic bomb. Even among those who were working on it, it was the work that they were doing. Most of them did not know the intended outcome. But awareness of the war itself was exceptionally high. Support for it in terms of money, military service, and a buy-in to the values for which it was ostensibly being fought, that was also high. Attention to the news of the front was high. Overwhelmingly, Americans they listened to FDR's radio broadcasts. Overwhelmingly, folks listened. America knew their nation was at war, and they knew why, and they kept up with the news of it. By January 11th, 1944, when Roosevelt gave his 11th State of the Union address, Americans had been at war for years and mobilized for it before then as the arsenal of democracy. 3 years earlier, in 1941 State of the Union, remember, FDR had urged Americans to get involved in the European war, to be that industrial arsenal of democracy in support of the four freedoms. All people in the world should have these freedoms, FDR argued, and America should get involved to protect them. And by 1944, we had. In the meantime, other than being the arsenal of democracy, America became the incarcerator of the Japanese. FDR's Executive Order 9066 was signed on February 19, 1942, instituting the concentration camps in which 117,000, mostly Japanese men, women, and children, some Italian, most of whom were born in America, would be imprisoned until the end of the war, some until 1946. And it's notable that 1988's Civil Liberties Act not only issued a formal apology to Japanese Americans, it also granted $20,000 each to over 80,000 of the Japanese Americans interned for this 4 years in reparations. So America did pay reparations. It did think it was worth paying reparations to people whom it had held incarcerated for 4 years. Can compare that to the 400 years of slavery. The Supreme Court upheld this order on the grounds that, quote, hardships are a part of war. The Japanese internment did go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, no, it's cool. Hardship happens. Meanwhile, what you see on the bottom right, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team fighting in World War II was entirely Japanese American. So there's that. Back to the 1944 State of the Union. Remember, America was mobilized. America knew they were at war. They knew why they were at war. They also knew that there were concentration camps on American soil. They knew that. So what some call America's only noble war wasn't itself without some of the betrayal of the values according to which and for which the war was waged. It may have been America's only noble war. Defeating fascism is certainly a noble cause. It certainly wasn't an altogether innocent war. The 1944 State of the Union puts those values right out there on the table. This addresses about urging continued sacrifice, about convincing Americans to subordinate their, quote, individual or group selfishness for the national good. Most famously, this speech introduces a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights, based, as FDR says, on the economic truths that had become self-evident. This speech tries to assert self-evident truths and inalienable rights specific to the economic context of free market industrialism. Roosevelt talks about solemn truths. He talks about eternally just principles in this speech. He introduces a complex kind of liberty, one that's wrapped up in several interlacing and overlapping kinds of security. He claims that our most deadly enemies are overconfidence and complacency. The notion that we somehow don't have to work for it, this freedom, this exceptionalism, that's our greatest enemy, according to FDR in this speech. Echoing Lincoln, he says that, quote, there is only one front. There is one line of unity that extends from the hearts of the people at home to the men of our attacking forces in the farthest outpost. Unless there is security here at home, he tells us, there cannot be lasting peace in the world. The battlefront and the home fronts are connected. The violence of one reflects and shapes the violence of the other. The values that are employed and mobilized in the violence on the battlefront, those values have a place in our conversations about violence on the home front. He didn't take it there. I'm taking it there. Without security at home, he tells us there will be no lasting peace in the world. And you might take a moment to think, is this true? Is it true today? You know, what does security at home mean for us today? And of course, we're inching our way towards the present. We will get there. One last point that I want to make from this speech. He tells us that we are looking for a, quote, just and durable system of peace for all, quote, freedom-loving nations. What this requires of us, he tells us, is unquestioned military control over the disturbers of peace, okay, as well as a decent standard of living for all individual men and women and children in all nations. Freedom from fear, he tells us, is eternally linked with freedom from want. I highlight this because it has absolutely continued through the lived experience and the living myths of America. We took it to mean that just and durable peace requires a preponderance of force, which has come through in the in terms of militarization, and also an increased free market, which has come out in terms of consumer capitalism. So a just and durable peace for us, following in some logical fashion what FDR told us here, requires the militarization which we see today combined with the consumer capitalism which we see today. And remember, just in passing, that that's what myth does, turns history into nature. That preponderance of force we brought with the Allies as part of an Allied force to the beaches of Normandy on what's known as D-Day, June 6, 1944. I've posted FDR's only public address from that day. It's a prayer, pre-printed in newspapers across the country so that Americans could pray along. And Americans did pray along. Reports came from all over the nation of people, families kneeling on their porches, whole communities kneeling on their sidewalks, whole congregations kneeling in churches, praying along with Roosevelt. So please do listen to that part of it, a quote from it. By the grace and by the righteousness, by thy grace and by the righteousness of our cause, our sons will triumph. They fight to end conquest. They're not fighting for conquest now. They fight to end conquest. Help us to conquer the apostles of greed and racial arrogances. And America prayed. And certainly conquering greed and racial arrogances is a just cause. FDR died on April 12th, 1945. Germany surrendered less than a month later, on May 8th. And Vice President Harry Truman took over as president, which he retained the presidency from 1945 to 1953. He did some things we mostly forget about. He tried really hard for a universal health care. Didn't get it. He desegregated the military in 1948. He vetoed a 1952 Immigration Act because it continued discriminatory policies. He also gave us the 1947 National Security Act and the massive military intelligence infrastructure that came along with it, and that, in turn, as we will see, made the Cold War possible. What's known as the Truman Doctrine holds that the U.S. will assist any democracy attacked by authoritarian forces, that we will get involved, that we are interventionist, and that we stand for democracy against authoritarianism anywhere in the world. Some say that this is what led the U.S. from its isolationism to be the global defender of democracy. And in some ways that seems to be true, but I would say, and I've said it before, that Wilsonian idealism did that already. And Truman held to the Wilsonian idealism formed part of the arsenal that Truman himself used in order to make what is now known as the Truman Doctrine. And of course, what Truman is mostly known for is none of this. It is for dropping the atomic bomb on August 6, 1945, on Hiroshima, the Japanese city of Hiroshima, which left 100,000, about, as you can imagine, counting deaths was near impossible. About 100,000 dead in an instant. And then on August 9th, 3 days later, on Nagasaki, which left about 80,000 dead. And the death toll was, most of it happened immediately, but the casualty count through injuries and cancers that continued to come, stomach cancer continues to be the highest, the greatest cause of death in Japanese folks, and that has to do with drinking, radiated water. So what followed was an armistice and then formal Japanese surrender shortly thereafter. World War II, with the bomb, ended total war. Any total war that followed would be globally and totally destructive. Any world war that followed would end in absolute decimation. Decimation is not the right word, because decimation actually means you sort of line up 10 and go down into you kill every 10th, right? So this is beyond decimation. This is total destruction. In terms of tactics, and we will turn to the Cold War next as a direct response to the profound existential threat of nuclear armament. But in terms of tactics, from here on out, the so-called limited war, that's the way to go. That's the name of the game. But so too is the militarization of America. Prior to 1945, the U.S. demobilized its armed forces during peacetime. After every war, demobilization happened. Troops were sent home to their lives, right? Large standing armies just weren't supported. They were cumbersome, they were costly, and we weren't at war. After 1945, the Soviets, who, remember, had lost anywhere between 25 and 30 million people fighting on our side in a world war, our response was to fear them. The Soviets provided us with a threat of global communism, which led to an immense standing peacetime military. We'll get to the Cold War. For now, 1945. Chief of Staff of the Army at the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, sent this cable to the War Department. This mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241 local time, May 7th, 1945. It was brief. No commander since has been able to send such a cable. No commander since has fulfilled his message. No job that the U.S. military has set out to do since then has been finished. And the U.S. has not demobilized its forces. Now, Eisenhower was a 5-star general, of which there have been precious few. There are none living today, for instance. So also was Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall. Now, the Marshall Plan was named after him. This was the plan through which through American support, Europe was rebuilt. It was a fraction of the amount of money we had spent on defenses, so... He was Times Man of the Year twice. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. He oversaw it. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for the Marshall Plan. He oversaw an unprecedented military expansion. The U.S. military expanded 40-fold over 3 years. Marshall oversaw that. And he said this. He said, "Our standard of living in peace is in reality the criterion of our ability to kill and destroy in war. Present-day warfare is simply mass killing and mass destruction by means of machines resulting from mass production." Now, Eisenhower, too, saw this connection between mass production, industrialization, and war, or militarization. And he, in the farewell address you read, warned us, the people of America, about the military-industrial complex, that connection between industrialization and militarization. He became the president. He was the president from 1953 to 1961. And in a 1953 speech titled "The Chance for Peace," he says this: Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. He then goes on to list what one could buy in terms of schools, roads, hospitals, with the money it takes to buy a single bomber. He says, "This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of a threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron." That's at the beginning of his first term in office. As he's leaving his second, in the farewell address which you read, his views have only become more substantiated, more clear, and the main point that he wants to get across there, that he wants desperately in his last act as an official before he returns to private citizenship, as he tells us, the one point he really wants to get across is that progress is not a value. Progress is a condition in which values might be expressed. But over the course of industrialization, through especially World War I, and then increasingly through World War II, and as we will see through the Cold War and CENTCOM's ascendancy in the War on Terror, progress itself has been seen as a value, which has allowed us to relegate our own national values to a secondary status at best, lip service at best. So we will turn next time to the Cold War and the way in which this plays out in the next era of American military engagement.